Greetings, fellow gardeners and composting enthusiasts. Welcome back to the Humus Heritage, where we dig deep into the living systems that nourish our gardens and our planet. Today we're tackling one of the most frustrating challenges that vermicomposters face. And it's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the gardening world. If you've ever watched your worm bin transform from a promising ecosystem into a slimy, stinking disaster, or if you've stared at a bone-dry bin, wondering why nothing seems to be happening, you're not alone. The culprit behind these failures isn't your dedication or your worms. It's an invisible imbalance that's sabotaging your efforts from the start. Let's unravel the carbon-to-nitrogen mystery and transform your struggling bin into the thriving composting powerhouse it was meant to be. The secret to worm bin success lies in understanding that you're not just feeding worms, you're cultivating an entire microbial ecosystem. Carbon and nitrogen are the two fundamental building blocks of this system, and each plays a distinct but equally vital role. Carbon-rich materials, often called browns, include items like shredded cardboard, dry leaves, newspaper, and egg cartons. These materials provide the energy source that fuels microbial activity in your bin. Think of carbon as the slow-burning fuel that keeps the composting fire going. Beyond energy, these brown materials create the physical structure your bin needs, forming air pockets that allow oxygen to circulate and creating a spongy matrix that absorbs excess moisture before it becomes problematic. Nitrogen-rich materials, the greens, include fresh food scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, and other moist organic waste. Nitrogen provides the protein and nutrients that allow microorganisms to multiply rapidly. This is absolutely critical to understand. Worms don't actually eat your food scraps directly. Instead, they consume the billions of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that colonize and break down those scraps. When you add nitrogen to your bin, you're essentially creating a feast for these microscopic decomposers, which then become a feast for your worms. The relationship is beautifully symbiotic, but it only works when carbon and nitrogen exist in the right proportion to each other. The ideal carbon-to-nitrogen ratio for vermicomposting falls somewhere between 30:1 and 50:1 by weight. This might sound intimidatingly precise, but here's the practical truth that will save you from overthinking it. Because carbon materials are so much lighter than nitrogen materials, you can achieve a good balance by simply adding roughly equal volumes of browns and greens. Picture this in your mind. For every handful of food scraps you add, you should be adding roughly the same volume of shredded paper or cardboard. This visual approach makes the science accessible and takes the guesswork out of the process. When this ratio shifts too far in either direction, your entire system begins to break down. Too much nitrogen creates conditions where oxygen gets depleted, anaerobic bacteria take over, and you're left with the characteristic rotten smell that makes you want to abandon vermicomposting altogether. Too much carbon, on the other hand, starves the microbial population, leaving you with a static, inactive bin where nothing seems to decompose and your worms languish in a nutritional desert. Understanding these two failure modes is the key to diagnosing and fixing whatever's going wrong in your bin right now. Let's start with the most common mistake, because chances are good you've experienced this at least once. You're excited about your new worm bin, you've been saving food scraps, and you enthusiastically dump them all in at once. Within a few days, you notice a sour, putrid smell emanating from the bin. When you open the lid, you find a wet, compacted mess that looks more like a science experiment gone wrong than a composting system. This is the classic high nitrogen disaster, and it happens because those food scraps are packed with moisture and nitrogen, creating an environment where anaerobic bacteria thrive. Anaerobic conditions develop when there's insufficient air circulation in your bin. The dense, wet food scraps compact together, squeezing out oxygen and creating pockets where only bacteria that don't need oxygen can survive. These anaerobic bacteria produce compounds like hydrogen sulfide and various organic acids, which is why your bin smells like something died in it. The acidity rises, the worms become stressed and try to escape, and you might even notice heat building up as the nitrogen-rich materials decompose too rapidly. This overheating can be lethal to your worms, who prefer temperatures between 55 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The fix is remarkably straightforward but requires immediate action. Stop adding any food scraps and instead focus on introducing carbon materials. Shred up some cardboard, tear newspaper into strips, or gather dry leaves and mix them generously throughout the bin. Don't just add a layer on top. You need to gently fluff and incorporate these browns throughout the contents to break up the compacted areas and restore air pockets. If your bin has developed a serious odor, you might need to add more browns than you think, essentially creating a thick blanket of carbon material that will absorb excess moisture and rebalance the nitrogen load. Within a few days, as oxygen circulates and the ratio corrects itself, you should notice the smell diminishing and your worms becoming active again. The opposite problem receives less attention but is equally frustrating. You've been diligent about adding bedding, perhaps even overly cautious after reading about the dangers of too much nitrogen. Your bin is full of shredded paper and cardboard, but when you check on it week after week, nothing seems to be happening. The materials look exactly as they did when you added them, the worms seem lethargic, and you're wondering if vermicomposting is just impossibly slow or if you've somehow ended up with defective worms. This is the high-carbon slowdown, and it occurs because there's insufficient nitrogen to fuel microbial growth. Without enough nitrogen, the bacteria and fungi that should be colonizing your bin materials simply can't reproduce fast enough to create the living food web your worms depend on. The bin may also become too dry, as carbon materials are absorbent and will wick moisture away from the environment. Worms need moisture to breathe through their skin, so a dry bin quickly becomes inhospitable to them. So, the solution here is to increase your nitrogen inputs. But, do this gradually to avoid swinging too far in the opposite direction. Start by adding food scraps in small amounts, making sure to bury them beneath the bedding layer. Coffee grounds are especially useful at this stage because they're rich in nitrogen, but they also have good structure that helps maintain aeration. Fresh grass clippings can work too, in small quantities, though be cautious. These can heat up pretty quickly if you add too much at once. As you introduce these nitrogen sources, keep an eye on the moisture level and lightly mist the bin if needed, aiming for that perfect wrung-out sponge consistency. Within a week or two, you should notice increased microbial activity and your worms becoming more energetic. Learning to diagnose your bin's condition really becomes intuitive once you know what to look for and, honestly, what each sign means. A properly balanced worm bin has a pleasant, earthy smell, kinda like a forest floor after rain. The contents should feel uniformly moist, but not soggy. So, when you grab a handful and squeeze, a few drops of moisture might appear, but it shouldn't drip continuously. The materials should have some structure to them, not compacted into a dense mass, and you should see worms throughout the bin, rather than clustering at the very top or bottom. Temperature is another useful indicator. The bin should feel cool to slightly warm when you touch it, but never hot. If you notice any heat buildup, that's a sign of excess nitrogen and rapid decomposition that needs to be cooled down with more browns. The rate of decomposition itself tells you a story. In a balanced bin, food scraps should be noticeably broken down within a week or two, gradually disappearing as they're converted into rich, dark vermicompost. If decomposition is racing ahead at breakneck speed or crawling along at a snail's pace, that's a clear sign your ratio needs a little adjustment. Your carbon to nitrogen management doesn't exist in a vacuum. It changes with the seasons and honestly, requires ongoing adjustment. During the summer months, you might find yourself with an abundance of nitrogen-rich materials like grass clippings and garden waste, while carbon materials become relatively scarce unless you've stockpiled them. This is when those saved cardboard boxes and newspaper become, well, invaluable. In winter, the opposite often occurs. You have plenty of dried leaves and carbon materials, but fresh food scraps might be your only nitrogen source. Smart vermicomposters anticipate these shifts and store materials accordingly, keeping a supply of shredded cardboard for summer, and maybe even freezing extra food scraps in fall to supplement winter bins. The activity level in your bin also changes seasonally, which affects how you should manage inputs. In warmer weather, microbial activity accelerates and your worms become more voracious, meaning you can add materials more frequently. Cold weather slows everything down, so you'll need to reduce your feeding rate to match the slower decomposition. Paying attention to these natural rhythms and adjusting your management accordingly is what separates a struggling bin from a thriving one. When you master the carbon-to-nitrogen balance in your worm bin, you're not just solving a technical problem, you're creating a sustainable system that transforms waste into one of the most valuable resources in gardening. Properly produced vermicompost is teeming with beneficial microorganisms, rich in plant-available nutrients, and structured in a way that improves soil health on every level. This dark, crumbly material enhances water retention in sandy soils, improves drainage in clay soils, and provides a slow-release source of nutrition that conventional fertilizers simply cannot match. Your garden plants will show the difference in their vigor, disease resistance, and productivity. Beyond the practical benefits, there's something deeply satisfying about closing the loop on your household organic waste. Instead of sending food scraps to a landfill where they'll produce methane as they decompose anaerobically, you're harnessing that same organic matter to build soil and grow food. You're participating in the ancient, elegant cycles that have sustained life on Earth for billions of years. That's the true heritage of humus. The understanding that waste is simply a resource in the wrong place, and with the right knowledge we can transform it into abundance. If this guide has helped you understand why your worm bin has been struggling and given you the tools to turn things around, please subscribe to the Humus Heritage channel and share this video with fellow gardeners who might be facing the same challenges. Together, we're building a community of growers who understand that healthy soil is the foundation of everything we do. Drop a comment below, sharing your own worm bin experiences, what's working for you, what challenges you're facing, and what topics you'd like us to explore next. Happy composting!